I just didn't know. Thank you. Pleased to announce our guest speaker tonight because basically she's talking about the outstanding women of the ball sellers. But in reality, for me, over the past several years, I've gotten to know Annette, and I have to say, honestly, she's one of the Arlington Historical Society's outstanding women. And when you think about women, yes. You see, I
just every month.
But I mean, you know, for me, being relatively new to the Arlington Historical Society, when you start to go and look at the books that we sell there and you see all of the women that have been involved with the Historical Society and all the books written, and it's impressive. And Annette just carries on to that tradition. And I'm just really been impressed to be working with her over these several years. Annette Benbow has been director of the Ball Sellers House Museum since the year 2012. She also currently heads the AHS events team and is the driver behind AHS's social media. And believe me, she is a driver, every day posting stuff on social media. She has written articles for the annual magazine and has given talks on local history topics to various Arlington audiences. She retired in 2020 after 35 years of service in the Central Intelligence Agency, where she was a political and counterintelligence analyst and then managed inspections of the Office of the Inspector General. She has a bachelor's degree in history from the University of New Hampshire and a master's certificate in public policy from the University of Maryland. Please join me in welcoming Annette.
Okay, let's see. I am going to bring this up. No, I am. Okay. So usually I'm not doing this part of the presentation, right? So hold on. So, yeah. Oh, there it is. Share. Oh, okay. That's what we want. Share. There we go. Get rid of this guy. I am screen sharing. Yay. Okay. All right. So women of the Ball Sellers House. So there's been a bunch of different adjectives that I've used, you know, amazing, historic, outstanding, but basically I'll let you decide. So how many of you have been to the Ball Sellers House? Oh, almost everybody. That's pretty good. I'm pretty happy about that. So of those people who have not been to it, how many have at least heard of it before tonight? There's a few more. Okay, good. All right, super. I appreciate that. Okay. I want to move my screen, advance. There we go. Okay. So just to familiarize you, in case it's been a while since you've been there, it is the oldest structure in the county. It was built around 1750. Architectural historians tell us that they are confident that it was on the ground in 1750. It could have been built anytime after 1742, when John Ball acquired 166 acres from Lord Fairfax when he was setting up in Fairfax County and carving it out of Stafford County. We have it as a museum that is open and it is free to the public. We have special events, we give special tours for groups, and we are open every Saturday afternoon from 1 to 4 from April through October. And I have some docents here in the room who I'm going to embarrass by telling us who they are. Come on, docents. There we go. All right, great. Thank you. I'm sure I have some online as well. So these are trained docents who give you a tour. They will answer your questions. They will tell you a lot about the house and how it was built and who lived there. And it is definitely a trip back in time. So it does, in fact, provide the glimpse of life of an average colonial farmer. But because of the length of time and the amount of research we've done on it, we can say honestly that it represents all of Arlington history. Okay. All right, so here are the women that we're going to be talking about tonight. We go back to the colonial era, and we zip forward about 100 years to Irene Young and Julia Powell. And then I can't resist but to tell you about Marion Reinhardt Sellers Wallace. She is the person who's made all of this possible by giving us the house. And this is, after all, the 50th anniversary of us owning the house. So I had to throw her in there. And I have tons of great photos that the family has given me. Okay, Elizabeth Payne Ball. She was born sometime around 1714. It is really difficult researching women in the colonial era because everybody was named Elizabeth and everybody was named Ball, and nobody wrote down as much as they should have to identify which one it is. So I don't know who her parents were because it's really difficult to tell for sure who we're talking about. But we do know that she did marry John Ball in 1735. So she was about 21 when she got married. Not too late, it's okay. She had 5 daughters. Interestingly, she has daughters, pretty much the children, pretty much every 2 years, except there's a big break between the 4th child, Elizabeth, and the last child, Mary Ball. There's a 10-year break. So if you know anything about colonial history or women in colonial history, you'll know that childbearing was extremely risky. And women died of it all the time. So I guess that she may have had a difficult pregnancy, and perhaps she miscarried, and hence there was a big break in time when it was usually, spot on every 2 years or so. So we don't know, but it was a challenging time to be a woman in the colonial era. We don't even know exactly what year she died. We know that we don't have any more historical information about her after 1792. So we're pretty sure that she had passed away before then. But before she did, she had a pretty lengthy life with John. So she moved to the Fairfax County when it was standing up. And as I said, he had 666 acres. And Lord Fairfax was making it very easy for families. He had really low, what we would now call rent. And he was encouraging families to come and stay and live there. There were many sequences of owners who did not stay on the property. They let somebody else farm it. They let somebody else manage it. So Lord Fairfax was really trying hard to make this a family community in Fairfax County. And at the time, it involved everything that is now Fairfax County and Arlington County and Alexandria City. So it was a pretty large county being formed out of Stafford County. They just kept carving and carving and carving. So Elizabeth and John lived together in this house for 24 years. Let's see. When John Ball died, he had a will that said to his executor, sell everything, come up with a list, sell everything, and divide the money equally between his wife and daughters. So that's a 6-way split. So 4 of the 5 daughters were already married. And so again, it's a 6-way split. And so until 1772, Elizabeth continues to live in the house. And she had to move out in 1772 when Moses Ball, her brother-in-law, and the executor of the will, sold the land and the house to William Carlin. William Carlin, the second owner, was a tailor from Alexandria City. He was an immigrant from England, like many in the area, and he was ready to move in, except in just a few months later, Elizabeth is supposed to move out. She is supposed to be long gone because he owns that property, right? However, in Fairfax County law, in Virginia law, which is based on English law, remember this is 1772, 4 years before the Declaration of Independence, the law said that a husband had to leave his wife more than at least a third of his property. So widows had what they called a right of dower. It's not a dowry per se, but it is a right of dower. And this is a right to a share of her husband's property. And usually it was a third. In this case, it would only have been a sixth and not enough for her to live on. No property, no land, and just a few pounds after you split everything that was sold into 6 pieces. So according to the law, a widow could stay in the house without paying rent, or in a house without paying rent. So the whole time that she is in the house from 1766 to 1772, she doesn't need to pay rent. It's her house, and it's not sold yet until 72. So then after it gets sold, the law protects women like her from being ousted and being put out, right? Just, on the street. She could have gone to live with her children. 3 of the daughters continued to live in the area. 2 had moved further west, but that apparently was not something that she wanted to do. She wasn't satisfied with the 6th that her husband left her, when in fact she realized she was due a third. Now, we don't know how she figured this out. I assume that she could read because he could read and may have taught her. We assume that the girls could read because he could read. But we really don't know how she found out about this law. Who told her? Maybe it was Moses, maybe it was her brother-in-law. But okay, so dower rights were really important for women. But widows rarely contested their husbands' wills, even when they failed to receive their lawful share. So nevertheless, just 4 months after the sale of the land to William Carlin, Elizabeth takes him to court and claims her dower rights. She gives up the paltry 1/6 of the property, and Carlin agreed. Now, there was no contest, I think, from Carlin because he understood the law, the judge understood the law, and it was a done deal. But this is not something that she would get if she was quiet about it. She had to take the step and go to court. So the map here shows John Ball's property, and the little red house in the center is pretty much where it is located on his property. It's pretty much in the center. We don't know what third of the property she lived on. I would think that she would live close to her brother-in-law's property, Moses Ball, and that is property that's just the little slit underneath John Ball's property. It was only 90 acres or less. So I would assume she would have lived there, but we just don't know where she went to live until she died before 1792. So it doesn't sound too exciting to us, but I bet it was really exciting for her to have to go to court and prove who she was, prove the will, and contest it. So that's our first special historic woman. let's zip forward ahead about a century to Irene Ottilie Hussey Young. For a long time, we didn't know anything about her. What we found out about her gave us a new appreciation for her. Before 2020, and thank goodness for a pandemic that confined me to my house, I did tons of research like never before. It was fabulous. That was the only good thing about it. Okay, so she was born in Independence, Iowa. One of my docents is from Iowa. Oh, two docents are from Iowa. That's right. Her father, Samuel Hussey, was a lawyer, and her father was actually pretty well known because he was a lawyer and an elected mayor for one term. His obituary described him as a prominent character. I would leave off the word prominent and just say he was a character. The newspapers printed a lot of bombastic quotes that he said about his cases as a lawyer. And he was acknowledged as the biggest lawyer in the area, but I don't think that was professional. I think that was physical. Okay, so with a father who's a lawyer and a one-time mayor, we can deduce that Irene probably came from an upper middle class family, which is important to the story. Okay. So here she was in Iowa. She meets a guy by the name of Robert Young. She's 19, and they get married on Christmas morning in 1876. Robert was born in England in 1852 and came to the US as a child with his parents, and they settled in Iowa and taught there. He graduated from a university in Iowa and taught in Iowa at a private school. He also kind of made a name for himself doing speaking engagements about educational theory. And he was really, people were sort of in awe of probably his accent and his carriage and his use of words and talking about education. So he got a lot of respect from apparently the scads of people who came to his presentations. So when they got married, they both taught in Iowa and they had a daughter named Vera. And then they moved to Helena, Montana, where Montana had just become a state, and they moved and they were teaching in Helena, which is the capital of the new state. And Robert was principal and Irene taught there. But suddenly in 1892, she's not teaching in Montana anymore. She sent a letter to her students from DC, and it's really a charming letter. It was published in the local paper in Montana, and it was to her students, and she was visiting a friend in DC. Well, during her visit, she went to listen in to a Supreme Court hearing, and she had a lot of really interesting and humorous and pithy observations about the case and the judges. So this is how we know this, right? Just from a letter that was published in the local newspaper in Montana. So what is going on with Irene? She's now living in DC. She's a clerk in the Pension Bureau. And lo and behold, in 1894, there is a divorce decree. What caused the split? Well, we're looking at this from 100 years out, right? But I can tell you that Robert's second wife was 13 years younger. Yeah, so we'll let you make your own historic conclusions about that one. Nevertheless, he was remarried. Divorce in this era was really rare. I mean, it was so rare that divorce hearings would appear in the local newspaper because destroying a marriage union was seen as a huge scandal, and it was not a private matter. Divorces mainly were granted to middle and upper classes like Irene because they were prohibitively expensive. So if you were poor and your husband's beating you or going out on the town without you, then just tough luck for you because you can't afford a divorce. So in many cases, even if you bring it to the judge can refuse to allow it. No matter if the husband was even beating the wife, or it didn't matter. It was totally whether or not the judge would grant it. So by the late 1800s, the divorce rate was slightly on the increase, but let's keep this increase in historic perspective. In 1890, the divorce rate was 0.04%. That's 0.4 out of 1,000 marriages, or 4 in 10,000 marriages. That is really, really rare, right? And in many cases, divorces were legally allowed with proof or physical cruelty, but it wasn't a for sure thing. So to give you a little bit more perspective, in 2021, the divorce rate in the United States across the board was 7%, up a little bit. So that's still not, it went down actually after the pandemic, assuming that people were not getting married as quickly as they might have. Okay, so even as divorce got slightly easier, there was still a lot of disapproval, especially for the wife. So nevertheless, she is a divorced woman. And Robert, he's remarried. So let's see. She is now ensconced in DC. She lives in DC. She's a teacher at the Western High School. Does anybody know what the historic context is or why we should care about Western High School in DC? Because of Arlington. Okay, so before W&L was built in 1924, all white kids in Arlington would travel across the Potomac and head to Western High School. That was their high school. So they were with other kids as well from the rest of DC, but that was the Arlington High School before W&L. So that's one more little piece of Arlington history, thanks to Irene. So our early lack of knowledge about Irene led some of us to believe that she was divorced, and as a result, she was reclusive. After all, we don't know anything about all this, but nothing, it turns out, could be further from the truth. She didn't let her marital status stand in the way of a full life. She was very involved professionally and personally in social events of the time. She attended teas. She was a member of the Wagner Music Appreciation Club. Apparently, he was a big German classical composer who was popular before World War I. And even her mother from Iowa came to visit her occasionally. She took the train out to Glencarlin occasionally and spent a weekend or some summer weeks, vacation time in Glencarlin, because that was the thing to do. Leave the city, it stinks, it smells, it's hot, and go to the country. So she actually rented the Ball Sellers house, or what we now know as the Ball Sellers house, for a few years before she actually bought it. And she bought it as a single woman, right? She was a lone woman buying a house. This was really unusual. She bought it at age 54 and she owned it until 1920. We think that she had an easy commute via the railroad that ran along what's now the W&OD Trail. And like everybody else in Glencarlin and further out, that was the way to get into the city to commute. So what else did we find out about her? Well, we found out she was a suffragist. She participated in the March 3rd, 1913 suffrage procession that was held the day before President Wilson's inauguration. This was a huge parade. It was planned along the same route as the inaugural parade will be the next day. And there were 250,000 spectators that streamed into the streets and blocked the parade route. This picture just gives you a sense of people streaming into the streets. And as national park historians, God love them, have described it, the marchers found themselves trapped in a sea of hostile, jeering men who yelled insults and sexual propositions to them. They were manhandled and spat on. The women got no help from the police, who looked on bemused, or admonishing the women that if they wouldn't be in this predicament if they had stayed home. Although a few women fled, most were determined to continue. They locked arms and faced the ambush. They held their ground until U.S. Army troops arrived about an hour later to clear the street so that the procession could continue. Irene was at the Treasury building where a pageant, the picture on the left, I'm sorry, right, where she was participating in a pageant or a play that was performed on the steps of the Treasury building, showing Lady Liberty waving at us in Greek costume, seeking the vote for women. It is very likely that Irene is in this photo, but we don't know what she looked like, and there was no description of who was there. We also have some pictures of her in school as on faculty, but they're group shots and there's no names underneath each individual person. So she could be in that shot too, but we don't know. The reason I'm so emotional about this is because I have a picture of her husband, but I don't have a picture of her. Okay, I'm still looking. All right. So she was a suffragist, and she was also a silent sentinel. A silent sentinel was a group of over 2,000 women who nonviolently protested in front of the White House during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, starting on January 10th, 1917. Nearly 500 were arrested and 168 served jail time. Many were imprisoned and tortured in the Occoquan workhouse. I am happy to say Irene was not one of these imprisoned. I don't know if she was arrested. She doesn't leave a historic trail to tell us. They were the first group to picket the White House, and they didn't stop until Congress passed the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution. At first, the picketers were tolerated, but they were later arrested on charges of obstructing traffic. She could be in this picture, but I don't know. This one's even more blurry than the other one. Okay, so in 1930, she returned to Iowa. Well, she sold the house in 1920 to Julia and Will Powell, and she continued to teach in the DC region. She actually taught in Maryland. And then in 1930, she returned to Iowa and lived near her daughter, Vera. She continued teaching there as a private tutor. She died in 1936, and her obituary called her Mrs. Young. And while it recounted that she left Montana to go to DC and cited how much her students through the years appreciated her, her obituary did not mention her husband or her divorce. Okay, let's zip forward another generation to Julia Kratzner Reinhardt Powell. Julia was born in Linville, Virginia. She was the eldest daughter of 9 kids, born to, I love these names, Isaac Newton and Victoria Elizabeth Reinhardt. They were longtime farmers in this rural area that's just north of Harrisonburg. As the oldest daughter, she probably had a lot of responsibilities about taking care of the kids while mom was busy doing everything else. And her claim to fame, in my estimation, is that she was among the women who were first allowed to enlist in the US Navy during World War I. So in 1904, long before the World War I, she moves to DC because that's where you go. Jobs are there. It's fun. It's exciting. It's moving to DC. And she lived as a maid in DC for a family. Okay, so not that exciting, but she had a job, and that DC was where the jobs were. So before she enlists, she is living with a family in Glencarlin, and she was working as a seamstress and then later as a government clerk. So she was also commuting on the train into DC for work. And I can just imagine both Julia and Irene being on the same train at the same time, going into work. Who knows, maybe they nodded to each other and said, how's the weather? We'll never know whether or not they knew each other, but they could have. Okay. So she becomes a US Navy Yeoman F. F as in female. In 1917, the US Navy is ordered to recruit women. Women free up men for battlefront jobs. They do a lot of the work that men have always done, clerking, answering the phone, you name it. But in this case, they were freeing men up so that they could go to war. They, posters like this one probably helped make Julia take service to her country one step further than most of the women. It says, US Navy, here he is, sir. We need him and you too. So she's bringing a male to sign up, and Uncle Sam is saying, well, that's great, but we'll take you too. So this was at the Navy recruiting station. It was a 1917 poster. She was inducted into the Navy as a yeoman at the Washington Navy Yard. She was almost 37 at the time, which was a lot older than most of the women that she was signing up with. They were in their early 20s. Julia was one of 11,275 yeomanettes, which is what the public dubbed them, who signed up to serve in World War I. Navy Secretary Daniels did not like yeomanettes. He thought it was condescending. Yeah, that's pretty wide open of him. So he insisted that they be designated Yeoman F. Well, not that open. Okay, so women had served in the military before World War I in the nursing corps. And they had served in the Army starting in 1901 and in the Navy in 1908. But nurses were civilians and civilian employees and had no military benefits at the time. Julia was active duty. So, big treat, here she is. This is the worst possible photo of anybody I have. But this is Julia Reinhardt in her US Navy unit. And the Rockingham Historical Society, God love historical societies, who did some research for me when I asked them, and they sent me this picture, which was fabulous. So it took Julia a day to file the application, take a brief test, pass a cursory physical, because they didn't have any doctors who could look at women, and swear to support and defend the Constitution. Pretty much the same oath I took when I went to work for the government. She was in for a 4-year hitch and started work immediately. There was no boot camp for her, but the Navy held night classes to familiarize the new recruits with naval routine and regulations. Officials assumed the yeomen would perform only administrative duties, but they also worked as mechanics and truck drivers, cryptographers, and telephone operators. A few went overseas. None were assigned to battlefield jobs, and the US Navy does not record any battlefield casualties, although 57 died in active service, mostly from the flu, the Spanish influenza. Julia caught the flu. Obviously, she survived. And she was out on medical leave for 2 weeks, but came back to work just before the armistice. Women worked 6 days a week, often late at night and on Sundays, and they were full of patriotic ardor and a sense of responsibility to the war effort. So there she is. And this is the ship that she was assigned to. Now, in some naval districts like DC, shore-based personnel were assigned for administrative purposes to a ship. She was assigned to the USS Triton, a tugboat. The tug operated out of the Washington Navy Yard and steamed up and down the Potomac River to the Naval Proving Grounds and to the powder factory in Alexandria. We'll never know if Julia ever saw or stepped on her decks, but for local policy, this was her assigned ship. Women received the same pay as male yeomen. They got a uniform allowance, medical care, war risk insurance, and they weren't given quarters to live in, but they got an allowance of $2 a day. The career span for Julia and many of the yeomen turned out to be brief. They were first recruited in March 19, and Julia enlisted in August 1918, and the war ended about 2.5 months later on November 11th, 1918. The final parade for the women was July 30th, 1919, even though they had signed up for 4 years. They were kept on inactive status until their enlistments expired and received a retainer of $1 a month. When they were discharged, they got $60 and a war certificate, a war service certificate. So that was her claim to fame. So Julia likely commuted to the Navy Yard from Glencarlin via train. After discharge, she settled back into work as a clerk for the Commerce Department. Somehow she met Will Powell, who also lived in his family's home in Glencarlin. He'd been in the Army during the war, and records show that he was doing logistics work in camps and bases in Virginia. Marion Sellers' family shared their photos of her Aunt Julia and Uncle Will. Here they are, growing old gracefully at the house they bought in 1920, what will become the Ball Sellers house. Will Powell worked at the Navy Yard. Julia worked for a while at the Commerce Department until the Depression. In the Depression, if you had 2 family members, more than one family member working for the US government, you lost your job because they were trying to even it out among people who needed work. So if you had one income earner, that was it. So here she is. She died in 1957 and was buried in the grave of her husband at Arlington National Cemetery. But as a veteran in her own right, she should have had her own gravesite. It didn't occur to anybody at the time to recognize that Julia too had been in the military. But her niece, Marion Reinhardt Sellers, wanted to recognize Julia's service. Persistence by Marion, assistance by the Arlington Historical Society, and intervention by then Senator John Warner unearthed Julia's missing service records. Finally, in 2000, 43 years after her death, a new headstone was installed, noting Julia's own service in the military as a Navy yeoman, 2nd class. She got promoted. Both Julia and Will's headstones stand next to each other in Section 3, Lot 5703, fittingly behind the Women's Memorial. Okay. Now, we are, as I said, on our 50th anniversary of owning the house, thanks to Marion Reinhardt Sellers Wallace. First, a little bit about Marion. Marion came to live in the house in 1932. She was left orphaned after her parents died within months of each other. Her brother, Hugh, tried to take care of her in Chicago, but family members suggested a different option. They asked Julia and Will Powell if she would take Marion in. The answer was, of course. Her daughter, Janet, explained this photo on the left to me. It was taken at the house in 1932. This is the day when Julia's brother, Hugh, arrived at the house with Marion. It's hard to see, but no one is really smiling in this photo. Not you, and certainly not Marion. When Hugh brought her father to be buried in his hometown of Linville, Virginia, he brought Marion to live with Aunt Julia and Uncle Will. This was a difficult adjustment for a city kid. She had family all around her in Chicago. Her mother Jane, her entire family was in Chicago, so she had many people around her. In an oral history with Marion, she says that she was really kind of lonely because there wasn't a lot of kids in the Glen Carlin area at the time. There was not even that many houses, certainly not as many as today. So I also found out that she went to WNL and graduated in 1940. And here is her yearbook photo in the center. And her daughter, Janet, gave me their wedding photo. This is George and Marion Sellers on their wedding day in 1943. He was in the US Army and he was going to be stationed in South Carolina. And then he came back up and was stationed at Bolling Air Force Base. So I wanted you to know how Marion Reinhardt Sellers came to the house and came to appreciate the age of the house, because she in fact did give us the house. She inherited the house from her uncle Will when he died in 1969. She tried renting it out to some families, but she did not like being a landlord. And she complained to a friend about, what can I do with this thing? If I sell it, they're just going to tear it down, and it's really old and really valuable and really special. So a friend suggested donating it to the Arlington Historical Society. The date of the gift is the date of the gift is dated January 14th, 1975. And we have a copy of it. We have a copy of everything. And this is Marion Sellers Wallace. She remarried after her first husband died in 1966. And this is her daughter, Janet, who gave me all the photos and some of the furniture in the house. And this is her son, James, who still lives in the area. I think he lives in Oakton. And so this is at the acceptance ceremony where we invited the board, we invited the members, we invited everybody and his brother, and she turned over the 4-inch brass key to the front door. Thank you, Marion Wallace. Okay, so there's one more woman that I cannot resist telling you a little bit about, and that is Martha Beggs-Worth. She was one of the first Ball Cellars House Committee members. And she was on it first when it was formed to accept the house in 1975. And it was led by Dean Allard. And you are looking, the picture on the left, there's a volunteer who is not identified. Martha is in the middle, and Dean Allard is on the ladder, and they're painting the house. They ended up painting it the wrong color, but we fixed that after paint analysis. But they gave it a good shot. And some on the Arlington Historical Society board hesitated to accept the house. We didn't have much money in the bank. That doesn't sound too unfamiliar. And a group of AHS members came together and said, how can we not accept this house? So they did. It's the oldest structure in the county. Martha, I knew her as Marty. She went on to be president of AHS from 1977 and 1988, and she headed the Ball Cellars Committee for years. She wasn't always the committee chair, but she was almost always on it, and she kept an eye on the house for the next 40 years. She passed away in 2021. She is the person who recruited me for this job. So I wanted to include her in the people who I feel are so key to the history of the house. Usually we hear a lot more about the Carlins because of course it's Glen Carlin. It's named after the 3 generations of Carlins who lived there, but that's another story. I wanted you to know about these women during Women's History Month and at the 50th anniversary of the house. So that's it. I hope to see you at our opening day and beyond. Our opening day is the 5th of April, first Saturday of every year of April. We are having a musical group called Bedlam. They are a early American colonial music group, and they will be doing 2 concerts for us. I consider them sort of interactive concerts because you can ask them about the music, you can ask them about their instruments, you can ask them about what they're wearing, and that is at 5620 3rd Street South in Glen Carlin, 1 to 4 on the 5th of April. I hope to see you there. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions if you have any. Because I have a lot of answers and a lot of stuff got, cutting room floor. Yes, sir.
How often has the original log beams been uncovered and looked at? I haven't been in the house in years.
Uh-huh.
Are they uncovered or is there siding?
So this gentleman is asking if the logs of the farmhouse are uncovered or how often they're uncovered. So there is a section of the house where the logs are visible. There is a section outside where you can see inside, and there's another section inside. So there's several sections that you can actually see the logs. And you can also see in the basement, and I'm sorry, the root cellar, you can see the logs with the bark still on them. So it is, come take a look. Okay. Sean.
Any I don't know, family reunions or any descendants of Elizabeth Benbow or Irene Hussey Young we know about?
So Sean asks about descendants of Elizabeth Painball or Irene Hussey Young. And Irene's daughter died 10 years after she did, but she left 2 sons, and I have not yet been able to track them down. I have their names from her obituary, but I have not been able to track them down. I'd like to. Elizabeth Painball, again, her 5 daughters, we're just begun to track. Some of them stayed here in this region, and one went to Western Maryland and another one went to what became Kentucky. So they were headed out west. But yeah, good question. Yes, ma'am.
My question was, can you speak to the right of dower?
Okay, what would you like to know more about it?
Wow.
She asks about the right of dower. I'm sorry? So she didn't actually own it, but she didn't have to be removed from it. So she had the right to stay on the property without rent, right? But really owning it, not so much. Does that answer?
I think of how to relate dower with dowry.
So the dowry was what she actually brought to the marriage, right? It could be animals, it could have been enslaved people, it could have been in this case, there's no evidence that he owned slaves yet. We haven't found anything, right, Jessica? Yeah, not yet. But it could have been linens, it could have been clothing, it could have been jewelry. It was things to help you start your household, right? But the right of dower, same kind of root of the word, but a little different use. Yeah. So anybody else? One more, yes?
So with Irene Young, so did she and her husband both move to Washington? No, so she just left him in Montana.
Yes, so the question is whether or not Irene and Robert moved to DC together, and the answer is no.
really know why she chose Washington.
She had a friend living here. So she was visiting a friend. Yeah, and I assume she stayed. Yeah, yeah. Marty, got anybody online?
I
What's the
have
question?
I have one question, and we had a couple people that joined late in the session, and maybe this question will help. You spent about 10 minutes on Elizabeth Ball, and the question was, why didn't John Ball leave his widow the house until her death? Why was the house sold? What did she live on when she had to move out? So I know you've presented that, but maybe there's a quick summary you can give.
So why did he do this? Why did he? Yeah, I don't know. We have no idea. We do not know what was in the brain of that man. He just, in his will, he said he wanted his entire inventory um, sold and the money split between his 5 daughters and his wife. So that was 6. And that's too little for the law to allow a woman to live on after her husband dies. Now, we have to not be too upset about having an inventory of the house because it has enabled us to furnish the house with all the things that were listed in it. A looking glass, a table, a bed, 2 walking spinning wheels, those kinds of things. So it's allowed us to furnish the house as it would have looked during their time together in it. And then what was the second part of that question?
Well, it was, let me go back here. What did she live on when she had to move out?
Oh, yeah. What did she live on when she had to move back? When she moved back to the 3rd that was left to her, right? So she probably had a little garden and puttered in the garden, you know, vegetables, that sort of thing. She had daughters in the area, right? She had 3 daughters that remained in the area, so they probably looked out for her. She had a brother-in-law, Moses, who was just south of her. So I would assume that there would have been people looking after her. She just needed a place to stay, and she wanted to stay on her own terms.
Okay, and we have one from the same person who has a derivative question, which is, did Elizabeth and her daughters get money from the sale of the house? How did they divvy this thing up? If it was divvied up 6 ways, what's the form of divvying it up?
Yeah, they must have had to divvy that up. He talks about the inventory, but he also says my entire estate, right? So that would have been 100 pounds that they acquired from selling the property. So I don't know, divide that 6 ways. So she would have gotten that, but that's still not enough really to live on. So she didn't have any place that she wanted to live. So I guess that's the answer to that.
Okay, good. That's all the questions we have in Zoom world.
Okay, one more look around. Anybody else? Okay, everybody's done. All right, thank you very much. See you at the Marcel's house on April 5th.
Thanks, Annette. Great job.